Sunday morning, March 2023. A mega church pastor in suburban Dallas stands before an audience of 3,000 people, and for the first time in his 30-year ministry, he notices something that makes his stomach drop. The worship center that used to overflow with 18 to 35-year-olds now looks like a retirement community meeting. The average age in the room is pushing 60. His youth pastor quit last month. The college ministry dissolved, and that morning, scrolling through the church's database before the service, he discovered that they've lost 42% of their members under 40 in just 3 years. He's not alone. Across the Bible Belt, from Oklahoma to the Carolinas, from Kentucky to Texas, something unprecedented is happening. The most religiously concentrated region in America is fragmenting at a speed that's leaving church leaders stunned, sociologists scrambling to understand it, and millions of former believers navigating entirely new lives. The numbers tell a story that would have seemed impossible 20 years ago. In 1999, 76% of adults in Alabama identified as evangelical Protestant. By 2023, that number had plummeted to 54%. In Tennessee, the decline was even steeper, from 71% to 48% in the same period. Mississippi, the most religious state in America, has seen church attendance among adults under 40 drop by 39% since 2010. These aren't coastal liberal cities experiencing gradual secularization. These are places where, "What church do you go to?" is still often the second question people ask when meeting someone new. Where high school football games open with prayer, where church attendance was once as fundamental to social identity as your last name. The exodus is happening so fast that pastors are using words like hemorrhaging and free fall. But what's splitting the Bible Belt isn't one clean break. It's fracturing along multiple fault lines simultaneously, creating a religious landscape that looks less like a monolith and more like shattered glass. On a Wednesday night in Tulsa, Oklahoma, 28-year-old Sarah Matthews sits in her apartment, staring at a text message from her mother. "We're praying you'll come back to church. Your father is heartbroken." Sarah grew up in a Southern Baptist household where church wasn't just Sunday morning, it was Sunday school, Sunday evening service, Wednesday night Bible study, youth group, mission trips, and vacation Bible school. She calculated once that between ages 5 and 18, she spent approximately 4,000 hours inside church buildings. She believed every word until she didn't. The breaking point came during the 2020 election. Sarah's pastor began weaving political commentary into sermons with increasing frequency. Climate change was a hoax. COVID restrictions were government tyranny. The election was stolen. "I remember sitting in the pew," Sarah recalls in a voice memo she recorded for a podcast about religious deconstruction, "and thinking, wait, I thought we were supposed to be talking about Jesus, not Fox News talking points." It was like someone had pulled back a curtain, and I suddenly saw how much of what I'd been taught wasn't actually about faith. It was about maintaining a particular political and social order. Sarah's story has become staggeringly common. According to a 2023 study by the Public Religion Research Institute, 43% of evangelicals under 35 cite the church's political involvement as a primary reason for leaving. This represents a complete reversal from previous generations, where political engagement was seen as a natural extension of religious conviction. The difference is what that political engagement looks like. For older evangelicals, political involvement meant opposing abortion and same-sex marriage. For younger evangelicals who've left, the church's politics looked like denying climate science, opposing racial justice movements, spreading conspiracy theories about the 2020 election, and, perhaps most significantly, overwhelming support for Donald Trump despite behavior that seemed to contradict Christian values. A pastor in Nashville, who spoke on condition of anonymity because he fears backlash from his congregation, describes the dynamic this way: "I have 70-year-old deacons who see Trump as anointed by God, and I have 30-year-olds who see the church's support for him as complete hypocrisy. There's no middle ground. Every sermon I preach, I'm trying to navigate this minefield, and I'm losing people on both sides. The older members think I'm too liberal if I don't preach about cultural decay and the left's war on Christianity." The younger members think I'm complicit if I don't call out racism and Christian nationalism. I used to feel called to ministry. Now I feel like a hostage negotiator who's failing. But politics is only one fracture line. The second is moving even faster and cutting even deeper. Deconstruction. If you've spent any time on TikTok or Instagram in the past 3 years, you've probably encountered the term. Religious deconstruction is the process of systematically questioning and often ultimately rejecting the beliefs you were raised with. It's not new. People have been leaving religion throughout history. What's new is the community, the vocabulary, and the speed. Social media has transformed what used to be an isolated, shame-filled experience into a public, collective movement. The hashtag exvangelical has over 250 million views on TikTok. The hashtag deconstruction has over 400 million. Thousands of people are documenting their journey out of faith in real time, creating a parallel digital infrastructure of support, validation, and shared experience that simply didn't exist a decade ago. Joshua Harris, the evangelical author whose 1997 book I Kissed Dating Goodbye sold over 1 million copies and influenced a generation of purity culture teachings, announced in 2019 that he'd deconstructed his faith and no longer identified as a Christian. His Instagram post about it went viral. Within days, thousands of people were sharing their own stories of deconstruction in the comments. The floodgates opened. What's particularly striking is the specificity of the critiques. This isn't vague rebellion or simple loss of faith. Former evangelicals are producing detailed, systematic deconstructions of specific theological frameworks, often with receipts. They're calling out purity culture's psychological damage with data from therapists. They're questioning young earth creationism with evolutionary biology. They're challenging complementarian gender roles with historical context about how those interpretations of Scripture emerged. They're interrogating the prosperity gospel light that many Bible Belt churches preached, the idea that God rewards faithfulness with material success, with the reality of poverty and suffering. A former youth pastor from Arkansas named Marcus Johnson created a YouTube series called 50 Questions I Couldn't Answer, where each episode tackles a theological or ethical inconsistency he encountered in evangelicalism. Episode 12, about how the church handled survivors of sexual abuse, has been viewed 1.7 million times. I spent 15 years telling teenagers they needed to bring their doubts to God, Marcus says in the episode. But when I brought my doubts to leadership, I was told I was opening myself to demonic influence. That's not faith. That's thought control. By the way, where are you watching this from, and what time is it? Are you someone who's experienced this kind of religious shift personally, or are you watching this to understand what someone in your life is going through? Drop a comment and let me know. I read every single one, and your stories help shape future content on Professor Archive. And if you're finding value in this deep dive, consider leaving a super thanks. It genuinely helps us keep making these long-form documentary investigations that you won't find anywhere else. The third fracture is the one church leaders talk about least, but it might be the most devastating: scandal fatigue. The Bible Belt hasn't just been losing members to political disillusionment and intellectual deconstruction. It's been hemorrhaging them through a seemingly endless cascade of moral failures by high-profile leaders. In 2021, a massive investigation revealed that the Southern Baptist Convention's Executive Committee had kept a private list of hundreds of credibly accused abusers but failed to take action to protect congregations. The list contained over 700 names. Victims who'd come forward were ignored, disbelieved, or actively shunned. The investigation revealed a pattern of institutional protection for predators that spanned decades. The report used the phrase stonewalling and intimidation to describe how survivors were treated. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. Churches left the Southern Baptist Convention in record numbers. Financial contributions dropped by tens of millions of dollars. But more significantly, countless individuals simply walked away from faith entirely. If this is what God's people do, one woman posted in a Facebook group for abuse survivors, then I want nothing to do with God. And the scandals kept coming. Hillsong Church, one of the most influential megachurches in the world, imploded after revelations about founding pastor Brian Houston's mishandling of his father's sexual abuse of children, followed by the very public moral failings of celebrity pastor Carl Lentz. Ravi Zacharias, one of evangelicalism's most respected apologists, was posthumously revealed to have sexually abused multiple women over the course of his ministry. Jerry Falwell Jr., president of Liberty University and son of the Moral Majority founder, resigned in disgrace after a sex scandal. The pastor of one of the largest churches in Texas was arrested for child sexual abuse. Each scandal followed a depressingly similar pattern: initial denials, victim blaming, accusations that critics were attacking God's anointed, eventual admission of at least some wrongdoing, usually minimized, and throughout it all, a conspicuous lack of accountability from the institutional church. For many believers, especially younger ones, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The same institutions that had taught them about absolute moral truth, that had demanded sexual purity and submission to spiritual authority, were systematically protecting predators and abusers. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable. "I could handle doubts about theology," says Emma Chen, a former worship leader from Georgia. "I could handle disagreements about politics. But when I watched my own pastor defend a colleague who'd been credibly accused of abuse, and when I watched our congregation rally around the accused rather than the victim, something broke in me that I don't think can be repaired." It wasn't about losing faith in God. It was about recognizing that the people claiming to speak for God were either complicit or delusional, and I couldn't tell which was worse. But here's where the story takes a turn that makes it even more complex. The Bible Belt isn't just splitting between believers and non-believers, it's fracturing within belief itself. While millions are leaving Christianity altogether, millions more are leaving evangelical churches for what they see as more authentic expressions of faith. Some are joining mainline Protestant denominations, Episcopalian, Lutheran, United Methodist churches that tend to be more socially progressive. Others are finding unexpected homes in Catholicism or Eastern Orthodox Christianity, drawn to ancient liturgy and sacramental theology that feels more substantial than the contemporary worship and self-help sermons of evangelicalism. Still others are creating entirely new forms of Christian community: house churches, decentralized networks, online faith communities that keep Jesus but jettison evangelical culture. This internal migration is creating its own tensions. Evangelical pastors in the Bible Belt are watching not just their youth groups evaporate, but their most thoughtful, educated, and engaged members drift toward liturgical traditions. One Baptist pastor in Kentucky describes it as losing our best people to incense and robes. Meanwhile, those who remain in evangelical churches are, on average, becoming older, whiter, more politically conservative, and more insular. This creates a reinforcing cycle. As younger, more diverse, more politically moderate members leave, the church culture becomes increasingly hostile to the very people it's trying to retain. Sermons become more politically charged. Worship becomes more nostalgic. The boundary between biblical truth and conservative political ideology becomes increasingly blurred. A youth pastor in Tennessee describes the dynamic. "I'll have a middle-aged member come up after service and say, 'That was great, but you didn't mention the transgender agenda or critical race theory.' And I'm thinking, we were talking about the Beatitudes. How did we get here?" But that's what they expect now. If you're not explicitly political in a conservative direction, they think you're compromised. And meanwhile, the few teenagers we have left are so burned out on culture war Christianity that they can barely tolerate another sermon. The geographic implications are fascinating and troubling. The Bible Belt earned its name in the 1920s when H. L. Mencken used the term to describe the South's concentration of religious fervor. For a century, the region's religious homogeneity shaped everything: politics, education, business culture, social norms. It was assumed that the Bible Belt would remain the Bible Belt indefinitely, a bulwark of traditional Christianity in an increasingly secular nation. But the data suggests something radically different is emerging. Urban centers in the Bible Belt, Charlotte, Austin, Atlanta, Nashville, are now seeing religious demographics that look more like Seattle or Portland than like their own rural hinterlands. Charlotte's Mecklenburg County, for example, has seen the percentage of residents claiming no religious affiliation nearly triple since 2000, from 11% to 29%. These aren't transplants from other states. These are people who were raised in Bible Belt Christianity and consciously walked away. The rural-urban divide within the Bible Belt is creating two entirely different religious ecosystems. Rural areas are doubling down. Church attendance remains high, political sermons are welcome, and there's social pressure to maintain religious affiliation. But in cities, religious participation is cratering at rates that rival the most secular parts of the country. This geographic split is creating profound social and political ramifications. The Bible Belt's political power has long been rooted in religious cohesion. When pastors spoke, congregations listened. When churches mobilized, voters responded. But as urban areas secularize and religious affiliation becomes less predictive of political behavior, that power is fragmenting. The 2022 midterm elections provided a preview. In Georgia, a state considered the heart of the Bible Belt, candidates who ran explicitly on Christian nationalism and had strong evangelical support underperformed, particularly in urban and suburban areas. Meanwhile, religiously motivated voters in rural areas turned out in force but couldn't overcome the numbers. The result was a split. Bible Belt politics no longer moving as a unified bloc. Pastors are noticing. A megachurch pastor in suburban Birmingham says, "We used to be able to turn out thousands of voters with a Sunday morning mention of an issue. Now, if I mention politics at all, I get angry emails from half the congregation and accusations of silence from the other half." The days when pastors were kingmakers in Southern politics are ending, and most of my colleagues are in denial about it. The economic implications are less discussed but equally significant. Bible Belt states have built entire economic sectors around religious infrastructure. Christian publishing, Christian music, Christian media, Christian conferences, missionary organizations. Religious education, the aggregate economic impact runs into the billions of dollars annually. Cities like Nashville, Colorado Springs, and Dallas became hubs for evangelical industry. As church attendance declines and affiliation drops, that economic foundation is cracking. Lifeway, Christian Resources, one of the largest Christian retailers in the country, closed all 170 of its physical stores in 2019. Multiple Christian publishers have downsized or closed. Bible colleges across the South are struggling with declining enrollment. Some have shuttered entirely. The Christian music industry, once a powerhouse in Nashville, has seen sales decline by over 60% since 2005. The ripple effects extend to non-religious businesses. Churches in the Bible Belt have historically been anchor institutions, driving weekend traffic to restaurants, hotels, and retail. As congregations shrink, Sunday morning commerce is shifting. One restaurant owner in Oklahoma describes noticing the change. "We used to be slammed every Sunday from 11:30 to 2. The after-church crowd was our biggest revenue day. Now Sundays are slower than Tuesdays. We've had to completely rethink our staffing." Perhaps the most fascinating and least understood fracture is generational. This isn't just young people leaving, although they are. It's the nature of how they're leaving. Previous generations who lost faith tended to drift away quietly, often maintaining some church connection for social or family reasons. The current generation is leaving publicly, vocally, and completely. They're not just stopping attendance, they're explicitly rejecting the label Christian and actively identifying as ex-evangelical. This public rejection is creating intergenerational trauma in Bible Belt families. Parents who raised children in what they believed was faithful Christian teaching are watching those children not just leave the church, but denounce it. The language young people use is often harsh, calling their upbringing spiritual abuse, describing purity culture as grooming, labeling certain theologies as toxic. For parents, this feels like rejection of everything they are. For adult children, it feels like freedom from systems that harmed them. The gulf is, in many cases, unbridgeable. Therapists across the Bible Belt report that religious deconstruction has become one of the most common sources of family conflict they see. A family therapist in Little Rock describes it. I have sessions where parents are genuinely grieving, not because their adult child did something wrong, but because they no longer believe. And the adult child is trying to explain that they're actually healthier and happier now, but the parent can't hear that as anything other than spiritual death. Both sides feel misunderstood. Both sides feel attacked. And in the middle is decades of relationship that's now incredibly fragile. Some families find ways to navigate it. Many don't. The private pain of this fracture is immense. Dinner tables that can't discuss religion, holidays filled with tension, grandchildren raised outside the faith traditions that defined their grandparents' entire identity. The response from Bible Belt church leadership has been, for the most part, defensive and inadequate. Some pastors have acknowledged problems and called for reform, particularly around abuse handling and political overreach. But institutional change in evangelical culture is glacially slow, if it comes at all. Most leadership responses have fallen into predictable categories: blaming secular culture, blaming liberal theology, blaming Satan, blaming wokeness, blaming everything except the possibility that evangelical culture itself might be the problem. There are exceptions. Some churches have made dramatic shifts, explicitly apologizing for past wrongs, changing their approach to politics, creating space for doubt and questions. These churches often survive the fracture better than their peers, but they're also often attacked by other evangelical leaders for compromising biblical truth. A pastor in North Carolina who led his church through a process of institutional repentance and cultural change describes the backlash. We publicly acknowledged our failures on racial justice, on abuse handling, on weaponizing politics. We changed our governance structure to include more accountability. We stopped treating doubt as sin. And you know what happened? Half our church left because they thought we'd gone liberal. Other pastors in the area warned their congregations to stay away from us. We're doing better now, healthier, more diverse, growing again. But we had to go through years of pain to get here, and most churches aren't willing to do that. The question that haunts Bible Belt pastors late at night is whether this fracture can be reversed. The data suggests it can't, at least not in ways that restore the previous status quo. Religious affiliation changes are sticky. Once people leave, they rarely come back in significant numbers. Second-generation religious knowns, people raised without religion, almost never join churches. The pipeline is broken. Some church leaders are shifting their focus from retention to rebuilding. They're accepting that the Bible Belt as it existed is gone and asking what comes next. This means smaller churches, less cultural influence, less political power, and a fundamentally different relationship between Christianity and Southern culture. For a tradition that has wielded enormous power for over a century, this represents not just decline, but a kind of death. Others are engaging in what critics call last stand. Christianity, becoming more insular, more politically extreme, more hostile to outsiders, more committed to maintaining power even as numbers dwindle. This approach tends to accelerate the exodus of moderates while solidifying a committed base. It's a strategy that prioritizes intensity over growth. The fracture of the Bible Belt is ultimately a story about what happens when the gap between stated values and lived reality becomes too wide to ignore. For generations, evangelical Christianity in the South proclaimed absolute truth, moral authority, and divine endorsement. When that authority was weaponized for political purposes, when that morality wasn't applied to powerful men, when that truth turned out to be culturally contingent rather than divinely ordained, millions of people did the math and walked away. Some found different expressions of faith. Some found no faith at all. But almost all found something they hadn't experienced inside the evangelical bubble: the freedom to question, to doubt, to disagree, and to define meaning on their own terms. The Bible Belt's fracture isn't a religious story alone. It's a story about power, accountability, generational change, and what happens when institutions prioritize self-preservation over the people they claim to serve. It's about the internet age making deconversion narratives visible instead of isolated. It's about marginalized people finally being believed. It's about political polarization infecting every aspect of life, including faith. It's about the end of an era and the uncertain beginning of whatever comes next. For the pastors who are terrified, the terror is justified. The world they built their identity and livelihood around is disappearing. The pews are emptying. The culture wars they won for decades are increasingly looking like Pyrrhic victories that cost them the next generation. The institutions they trusted are revealed as fallible at best and actively harmful at worst. But for millions of people walking away, there's a different emotion: relief. Relief at no longer performing a faith they didn't truly hold. Relief at escaping communities that demanded conformity and punished authenticity. Relief at discovering that leaving God's people doesn't mean leaving goodness, meaning, or community. The Bible Belt is splitting, and it's not going back together. What emerges from the fracture remains to be seen. Perhaps a more humble, more accountable, less politically weaponized Christianity. Perhaps a thoroughly secular South that resembles the rest of developed nations. Perhaps something entirely new that we don't yet have language for. What's certain is this: the days when you could assume your neighbor, your coworker, your Uber driver in Birmingham or Nashville or Oklahoma City was evangelical Christian are over. The Bible Belt is becoming the Bible Belts: plural, fractured, contested territory where religious identity is chosen rather than assumed, where faith communities compete rather than dominate, and where the question, "What church do you go to?" might increasingly be met with, "I don't." For those who grew up in Bible Belt Christianity, whether they stayed or left, the fracture is personal. It's family dinners that can't discuss certain topics. It's old friends who now seem like strangers. It's looking at your childhood church and feeling grief for what it could have been. For the rest of America, the fracture matters because the Bible Belt has shaped national politics, culture, and discourse for a century. As it splits, as its religious cohesion dissolves, as its political power fragments, the entire landscape shifts. We're watching not just a regional transformation, but a national one, happening in real time, one deconstructed faith at a time. Thanks for watching this deep dive on Professor Archive. The story of the Bible Belt's fracture is still unfolding, and we'll continue following it. If you learned something new or appreciated this investigation, the algorithm rewards comments, so drop your thoughts below. And if you want to directly support this kind of long-form documentary content, a super thanks goes a long way. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep seeking truth wherever it leads.